All right, let's take our Bibles and open up to Genesis. We were set up well last week with AJ's lesson on really an impossible task of covering 10 chapters. When AJ said that he wanted to teach one of the lessons on Abraham, I gave him the 10 chapters, and I'll take the 2 or 3. He did a great job with that last week, that's right. We're going to pick up the conversation now looking at Abraham starting in chapter 22. And really, I'm going to suggest to you, maybe it doesn't really need to be suggested, maybe it's a given, but what we really have happening here in chapters 22, 23, and 24 is a continuation of God starting to fulfill the promises that he made to Abraham. Really, it starts in chapter 21, right? What happens in chapter 21? Okay, somebody look back at the heading in your Bible on chapter 21. What's that? Yeah, Isaac's born, right? What is God's promise to Abraham? Your seed are going to be like the stars in the sky, and you're going to fulfill a nation. It's going to be through Isaac, not Ishmael, right? So God is beginning to deliver on those promises with the birth of Isaac. We really have a continuation of that starting here in chapter 22. Chapter 22, Abraham's going to be tested. Chapter 23, and it might surprise you, I'm not going to talk about necessarily the death of Sarah a whole lot. What happens in chapter 23 that is really significant is Abraham becomes a landowner. Chapter 23. In chapter 24, we see Abraham's provision, God's provision for Abraham's progeny. Right? We see Rebekah chosen for Isaac as a wife. If I were going to put a name on today's lesson, the whole of the 3 chapters, I would name it this: Jehovah Jireh. My God will provide. Explain that a little bit later, on how it relates to all 3 of these chapters. But first, let's take a look in chapter 22. My method this morning is simply going to be to wander through these chapters, hitting highlights. I would love a water, thank you. Is to wander through these texts and draw out the highlights for you along the way and try and make the connection and make a gospel connection for you as well as we go on. On your outlines, it's a really simple outline, and I've only left you a few blanks, and you'll know that there's lots of space between points. That's just so you can freely have space to write down anything that you might like to write down on the things that I talk about. Okay? Chapter 22, I've entitled this section, Abraham's Faith. And what you have here is a description of God's command to Abraham to offer up Isaac. And that's got to be shocking. Here it is. We've been seeing over and over again God's promise to Abraham that he's going to provide for him and make him a father of many nations, and his descendants are going to be like the stars of the sky. And it's not Ishmael, it's going to be Isaac. And then we get to chapter 22, and he says, here's what I want you to do. Take Isaac up, build an altar, and sacrifice him on the altar. I want to take first a look at the command. Second, we'll look at Abraham's response. I'm going to talk about Abraham's thoughts, his emotions a little bit, and we'll go from there. First of all, let's look at the command in chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham. Moses does us a favor right there. Can you imagine if that phrase wasn't there? If it just said, after these things, God said to Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will show you. Now, from Abraham's perspective, that's what happened. He doesn't get the narrative that Moses gave. Hey, Abraham, I'm going to test you now. Go do this. He just gets the instruction. For our benefit, to avoid confusion for us, we get Moses' narrative that God's testing Abraham in this instruction. But we have to look at it a little bit from Abraham's eyes. Here's the command. Take the promised child up to this mountain and offer him there as an offering. This is a burnt offering. The way the burnt offerings were typically happened, drawn out, was it would have involved slitting the throat, letting the blood run out, dividing the body into parts, and then burning it. I want you to think for a minute. This is what is going on in Abraham's head when he is told to go offer Isaac as a burnt offering. These are the steps that he's having to process without the benefit of Moses' first words that God's testing him. And so there's the command, but we look at the response starting in verse 3, and to me this is equally striking. I highlighted just the first 4 words in my Bible. So Abraham rose early. Stunning. Abraham's obedience. Any of you had a time when you faced a really difficult decision? And what is our typical response to a difficult decision? Some of us might not get out of bed the next morning. We're going to labor over it. And we're going to run through every possible fear that our imagination brings to our minds. And we're going to struggle with it. And we're going to call 3 friends. And we're going to pray about it. And we're going to bargain and argue with God about it. And this is going to go on and on and on and on. Right? Labor over a decision. Abraham rises early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and he arose and he went to the place of which God had told him. Amazing obedience. And at the same time, I'm not sure that should really surprise us that much. Go back to chapter 12 and verse 1. God's instructions to Abraham were what? Get up, go, leave your country, leave your people to a land that I'm going to show you. And it tells us in verse 3 that Abraham went. In chapter 15, verse 5, God tells Abraham, your offspring are going to be like the stars of the sky. How old was Abraham in chapter 15? 80? He's an old man, right? And he wonders how that could happen, but it says there in verse 6, so Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Come back to that later. We believe God. Chapter 17, Abraham's told, keep my covenant. This shall be the sign of my covenant, the circumcision, right? And he has the instructions regarding the circumcision. And then in verse 23, it says Abraham took Ishmael and all the men of his household, and those that were serving there, and he obeyed God. What's Abraham's pattern? God says do something, and he obeys. God says do something, and he obeys. Right? It's a pattern of life for him. But here, this request is so much more. I say request, it's not a request, it's a command. This command is so much more than what he's had to follow so far. And yet, nevertheless, it was his obedience to it, his pattern, to immediately rise up and go do it. Was Abraham's faith always this strong? No. Why? Give me an example.
Well, when he was with the Pharisees, he was with his wife Sarah, and he told a lie and said it was his sister, for fear that, the Pharisees would take her on his wife.
Yeah.
It was a half-truth.
Technically a half-truth. Technically a half-truth. But you're right. When I raised my kids, if you tell me something that's only partially true with the intent of deceiving me, then it's a lie. Right? But that's what Abraham did. And why did he do it? He feared. He says, they're going to see you, and if they know that you're my wife, they're going to kill me. Where did that fear come from, Abraham? You're willing to leave family and the country you're familiar with and go to a land that you don't know what it is and step out because God told you to do that, but then when you're confronted with one of the first difficulties that comes along, you've got to figure your own way out of it? No, Abraham's faith was not always this strong. Abraham, in chapter 15, I talked about that earlier, he's given the promise that your descendants are going to be like the stars of heaven. And Abraham believes God, and it was counted unto him as righteousness. And then what's he do? He decides, I'm going to solve this problem. I'll hook up with Hagar, right? And Ishmael is born. And later on, God has to say, no, that's not the one. Abraham, again, tries to solve his own problem. In chapter 17, it's kind of an interesting dialogue that's going on. God's reiterating his promise, and Abraham's starting to bargain with God. Right? In chapter 17, he says, in verses 15 through 19, he's bargaining with God. He says, that Ishmael would walk before you in your ways. God has to tell him, no, it's not Ishmael. He's not the one that's going to do this. Chapter 18, Abraham gets asked the question, is anything too hard for God? He has to think about that. And later in chapter 18, Abraham bargains with God over Sodom. Remember the story of Lot? What if there are 50 righteous? Well, what if there are only 45? What if there are 40? He starts bargaining with God over it. But you don't see that here. You don't see Abraham trying to solve the problem in his own strength, and you don't see him bargaining with God. Oh God, not Isaac. What about fill in the blank? You don't see him countering. What you see him do is rise up early in the morning, get his stuff together, and go. So no, his faith wasn't always that strong, but it's clearly presented as a strength here. Right? What's going on in Abraham's thoughts? Well, Moses doesn't give us any of that. And it's kind of good. He simply gives us the facts. God gives a command, Abraham does this stuff, and he goes. He really doesn't let us have any insight into what's going on in Abraham's mind. Did he question God? Maybe. Did he fear? Did he even contemplate not obeying? We don't know. And there's a lot of speculation. Go read commentaries and things, and they'll all talk about the different things that are going on in Abraham's mind. He's a human. We know that. He had to have faced some of the fears and challenges and difficulties that we would have with such a decision. One commentator points out the fact that he saddled his donkey and then went and chopped the wood. That's not really a very logical progression of activity. Normally you would get all your stuff ready, and the last thing you do would saddle the donkey and then get going. So maybe he was a little scatterbrained. Maybe he was a little flustered in terms of what he was doing, and he was running around. I don't know. I suspect that Abraham, this is just me, total pure speculation, but I think Moses doesn't tell us because he wants us to stop and contemplate. What would you have done? What would have been your response? Maybe I can ask it another way. What difficult choices are you facing today in following and being faithful to God? What emotions are you struggling with? What are you going to do with that? I'll tell you a story. Maybe I've shared this before, but one of the things that was a crisis of faith, not that compares in any measure to what Abraham is facing here, but a little bit of a crisis of faith for me. We, raising our children, above all else, always said, I just want them to follow God with their whole heart. Whatever He wants them to do, they're His. I want them to go. And then my daughter tells me that she wants to go to Africa for 2 weeks in an unsupervised trip, connecting with somebody that runs an orphanage there who we didn't have direct, I knew of them. We had some indirect connections to who they were, so they weren't total strangers. And the first question we ask is, well, can we send mom with us? Right? Mom and daughter, it's a great mom-daughter trip, mission field. Why? I had some sense of comfort that parent was there. By the way, South Africa is about 9,000 miles from here. Right? You can't call Dad and say, hey, Dad, I got this problem. And you can say, I'll be there in a minute. It doesn't work that way. Right? And it was a challenge for me as a dad. Like we have this false sense that we can protect our kids anyway, which really, is sort of a false thing. But the question I had to keep asking myself is, Dad, you believe what you said all these years? You just want them to follow me? You just want them to go where I tell them to go? And you're going to be okay with that? And I prayed a lot during that time. Right? Much bigger scale for Abraham. But I think, what's the crisis of faith that you're facing? What's the difficulty in pursuing God wholeheartedly that you're facing? What's the challenge that you have with your kids that you're facing? And can you have the kind of faith that Abraham displays that says, God, whatever it is, they're yours, I'm yours, I'm going to obey. And how long will you labor over that decision? So we don't know what's going on in his head. There had to have been lots of wrestling with emotions. It was a crisis of faith for him. And he responds in faith, believing God from the beginning. Now, a couple of other verses to look at. Look down in verse 5. And there's some debate over these verses. I'll give you my view. Verse 5, he leaves the young men behind. He says, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Is that a statement of faith? Is it a prophecy? Or is he just deceiving the young men about what he's about to go do? Some people will suggest that he's just not being totally forthright. He doesn't know what's coming. He doesn't know what it's going to be, and he doesn't want to tell the young men what's going to happen. He doesn't necessarily want to scare Isaac and alert him to what's happening next, and that's why he tells that story. Go down to verse 8. It says, let's see, that's verse 6, I think. My numbers are too small. Verse 8, Abraham said, back up. Verse 7. Isaac says to his father Abraham, they're on the way now, they leave the servants behind, they're carrying the stuff up to the place of sacrifice. He says, my father. And he says, here I am, son. And he says, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And so they both went on together. Did he say that to give comfort to Isaac? To deceive Isaac about what was going to take place? Or did he say it in confident expectation that God was indeed going to provide the lamb? Well, I'm going to argue, from my point of view, that he said it, both of those circumstances, because of a complete faith and trust in God, that whatever was going to happen, and however it was going to happen, God was going to deliver on his promise to give him the descendants through Isaac. I base that at least partially on Hebrews chapter 11. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, look at verse 17. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him a while back. What was Abraham expecting? Abraham fully expected that God was going to deliver on his promise to provide him the descendants through Isaac. And if that meant he cut his throat and divided him asunder and burnt him up, that God could still raise him from the dead and bring him his descendants. That was the level of faith that Abraham had. Third thing I'd have you notice, Abraham's faith is a pattern and an example for us. Turn over to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. I know I said 4 on there, but I'm going to back you up a little bit. Romans chapter 3, we're going to look down at verse 27. Start there. 3:27, Paul writing here says, "Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law." What's Paul saying? Two things. First of all, righteousness comes by faith. Righteousness comes by faith, not by the works of the law. Not that there's any boasting. There's nothing that you can brag on. You can't say how good I am. Righteousness simply comes by faith. Secondly, righteousness is provided to both the Jews and the Gentiles by faith. Not one or the other, but both. Now look in chapter 4. We'll read this whole passage starting in verse 9. Chapter 4 and verse 9. "Is this blessing then only for the circumcised, or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness." Genesis 15:6. Right? "How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised?" Well, in what chapter is Abraham going through the ceremony of circumcision? It's chapter 17, right? He gives us the answer here. "He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised." The faith he had while he was uncircumcised. It was counted to him as righteousness before the circumcision. Later he became circumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. This thing about walking in the footsteps of faith that Abraham walked in. Remember in chapter 17, verse 1 in Genesis? What did God say to him before he gave him the command to be circumcised? "Walk in all my ways." Walk in all my ways. Abraham was walking with God by faith before the circumcision. That was just a continued commitment on his part. And he made him the father of all of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised by faith, but also walk according to him. We'll stop there. You can read through the rest of the passage. This is the pattern that you find in Romans chapter 4. Righteousness comes by faith for the Jews and also for the Gentiles. And Abraham is our example. He was obedient to God and by faith, and counted for him as righteousness. See on your outline there, we have the provision. Go back to Genesis chapter 22, and you know the story there. Genesis 22, Abraham has Isaac now on the altar. He's bound. He raises the knife. God speaks to Abraham, and it says in there that, behold, that there was a ram caught in the thicket. Abraham's surprised. There's part of me that wonders a little bit about that. Why would he be surprised? He told the men, "I'm coming back with Isaac," right? He told Isaac that God was going to provide for him a lamb for the sacrifice. I wonder a little bit why he was surprised at the ram that was in the thicket. When God finally provides what it is that Abraham expected him to provide along the way. I don't know. Maybe he was just surprised because the ram didn't make any noise and suddenly it was there. He didn't hear him coming or something. I don't know what made him surprised, but he was. And God provides. Abraham calls place Jehovah Jireh. All right, any questions on chapter 22?
Do you know how old Isaac was?
So that's a good question. And there's some speculation around that, but the expectation is he was probably a teenager at this time. At minimum, it talks about how Abram takes the wood and puts it on Isaac, and Isaac's carrying the wood. So he had to be a big enough boy to carry the wood, right?
Probably old enough to fight back against his 80-year-old father.
Well, that's a good point too, right? So certainly if he was strong enough to carry the wood, by the way, the donkey stayed back. Why did the donkey stay back? I am sure for the 3-day journey, the wood wasn't being carried by Isaac, being carried by the donkey. And the expectation is climbing up this mountain, the terrain was actually too rugged for the donkey to get to the top. So the boy had to be strong enough to carry the wood over what would be rugged terrain, right? And that's true. Certainly, the expectation, I didn't even talk about Isaac's character and disposition during this crisis of faith, but would have been strong enough to fight back against an 80-year-old dad, right, as a young man, but he didn't. And Moses doesn't record for us any interaction except for Isaac asking the question about where the sacrifice was going to come from. When he gets up there, it's like you're binding Isaac. There's nothing, hey, Dad, what are you doing? Hey, Dad, why am I on the altar? None of that. There's this sort of display that we have to assume is this complete faith and trust in his dad. And I would say by extension, what surely his dad had communicated to him about God's promises. Right? So Isaac, I think, demonstrates the same kind of faith that takes place there. All right, chapter 23. Let's look at, I'm going to call this Abraham's land. And I don't mean to be dismissive of the sadness of the fact that his wife dies, but you're pretty much dealing with that in verses 1 and 2, and the rest of this you have as really what takes place between Abraham and the folks that own the land where he's dwelling, the Hittites. Okay? So verse 1, Sarah dies after living 127 years old, and certainly Abraham is mourning Sarah, the loss of his wife, and to weep for her. But then you get to verse 3, it says, Abraham at the end of his mourning, rises up from before the dead and said to the Hittites, I'm a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury the dead out of my sight. And then you have this dialogue with the Hittites over his request for a piece of land. And look in verse 6. Hear us, my Lord. You are a prince of God. Push pause for a minute. Let's think back a little bit. What were among the promises that God gave to Abraham? Particularly chapter 12. God said, I will make your name great. Remember, it comes right on the heels of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, mankind got together and said, we're going to make a name for ourselves. And God confuses the languages and divides the people all up. And then you get to chapter 12, and God says to Abraham, I'm going to make your name great. Here's Abraham in a foreign land. The Hittites own all the land. He's just a sojourner. He's just wandering around. He negotiates earlier for rights to a well so he can feed his flock the water and things like that. But he's got nothing aside from his stuff and his people. Right? He has no property. And the Hittites say to him, you're a prince of God. 2 observations. God's already starting to make a name for Abraham. People around him and see him recognize that God is blessing this man's life. I don't want to get too caught up in application here, but is that true of you? And I'm not talking about how much stuff you have. I'm not talking about all the gold and silver and sheep and goats and camels and servants and all that kind of stuff that you might have hanging around your house. I'm talking about, do people recognize that you are blessed by God? Let me give you a hint. If you're constantly grumbling and complaining about your job or the things that you don't have, the message your neighbors and friends are getting are not, you are joyfully blessed by God. It's something else. Our dissatisfaction, our lack of contentment does not communicate to people that God's blessing us. What does? The joy we heard about this morning, that the disciples had even in the midst of their persecution. Says to everybody around them, this person's blessed by God. I don't understand what's so strange about this. Here's Abraham, a sojourner, and everybody around him recognizes that he's blessed by God. And then he enters into this negotiation. They're like, look, what's it to us? You can have the cave. Go ahead and bury your dead in the cave. And he's like, no, I want to buy it. And he picks out a particular cave that he wants to buy. And he's back and forth. Back with Ephraim about this cave. And Ephraim's like, just take it. We'll settle up later. Doesn't matter to me. What's it between us? 400 shekels of silver. And Abraham insists on paying full price. 400 shekels of silver might have been exorbitant for the value of the piece of property that he was looking at, but that was okay with Abraham. Why? Well, in that culture, Ephraim, had he died, his descendants would have been able to come back and say, okay, hey, we want the property back. He gave it to you, but he's gone now. Right? There could have been a contention over that. Now there's no debate. Abraham buys the property. He owns the property in Canaan. This is the beginning of God delivering on his promise that land was for him. He becomes a landowner. God makes his name great. And when you review the promises, promised the land, promises a name. He promises to bless Abraham, right, in chapter 15. And Abraham here is recognized as being blessed. And then also you look back on the promises that God makes to Abraham. And what's he say? It's through Isaac that your descendants are going to be. And that's really a good segue into chapter 24. So chapter 23, we continue to 22, Isaac's born. 21, Isaac's born, right? In chapter 22, we see his crisis of faith. In chapter 23, we see God starting to deliver on the rest of those promises, the land and the blessing and the great name. And then when you get to chapter 24, he's providing a wife for Isaac, the means by which the rest of these descendants are going to come from. Abraham's progeny, I can't remember, or a wife for Isaac, however you want to fill in that blank on number 3, is really our lesson here in chapter 24. And I'm going to have to give these to you fairly quickly, which is going to make the romantics in the room sigh in disappointment. That's the case. But a couple of things just real quick. Look in chapter 24, verse 1. Abraham is old and well advanced in years. And the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Again, God delivering faithfully on his promises. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. But you will go to the country, to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. Pause there for a minute. Can we go back just briefly to the end of chapter 22? Look at chapter 22, verse 20. After these things, after the crisis of faith and God's reiteration of his promise again because of Abraham's obedience, it was told to Abraham, behold, Milcah also had borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz, his firstborn, and Buz, his brother. Those guys must have gotten teased awful. Kemuel, and the father of Aram, Chest, Hazo, Filda, and so on. We have, it's interesting, we don't have time to dig into it, but there's 12 listed. Remember, we've also had 12 tribes of Israel eventually, but we have 12 listed here. 8 from Milcah, 4 from a concubine. And so Abraham becomes aware in chapter 22 that his brother is still living back in the land there and has siblings, has children, not siblings, children, right? And so when we get to 24, Abraham's making his servant now say, go back to my family's household, find a wife for Isaac there. And so, picking up where we were, the servant says to him, verse 5, the servant says to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham says to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my land and from my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me that your offspring will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. Is it any wonder at this point in time that Abraham's faith is unflinching? You got to hear the confidence in the way that Abraham is communicating this to him. Abraham goes on and he says, but if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you're free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. Was Abraham concerned about having to release his servant from this oath? I don't think one iota. Not the slightest. He knew God was going to provide. The servant didn't. So that was a good escape for the servant to say, okay, well, if they don't cooperate, I'm free. I don't have to do anything. So the servant put his hand under his thigh of Abraham, his master, and he swore to him concerning this matter. And we'll go on from there. So the servant gathers a bunch of goods. He travels over to the land of Abraham, and then look down in verse 10. The servant took the 10 master's camels, taking all sorts of choice gifts, goes to Mesopotamia to the city of Nahor, and he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well at evening time, the time when the women go out to draw water. The servant wasn't stupid. He understood what the customs were. He says, this is going to be the prime place for picking out a woman. He goes and sits out by the well. The women are going to be coming out and drawing water. And he makes a deal with God. He prays to God. He says, let the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who will say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one that you have appointed for my servant Isaac. By this shall I know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. And love this in verse 15. Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. At the time when all the women would be coming out, I don't know, maybe Rebekah was early. You get the impression that she's the only one coming to the well at this moment, while the servant is still speaking and asking God that he would provide this way. And then you know how the story goes. Rebekah draws water, he asks for a drink, she gives him a drink, and says, I'll provide for your camels too, and he's got to be stunned. Remember, this is the servant. He doesn't have the faith that Abraham has. He was the one wondering, what if she doesn't go with me? What do I do? I take the son back? What do I do? I'm nervous about this commitment, right? And he's stunned that God is providing in this way. So God proves himself to a servant. In verses 28 to 52, God secures the family's blessing. The servant tells Rebekah the story, finds out if they have room back at the house. He goes back to the house, he meets with the father and the brother, and he tells them all the same story about his commitment to Abraham and what Abraham has done. He secures the family's blessing. And then look in verse 53 and 58. Stop there pause there for a minute. 53 through 58. I want you to see the faith that Rebekah has. Down at 53, says, and the servant brought out jewelry of silver and of gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah, and he also gave to her brother and to the mother costly ornaments. And he and the men who were with them ate and they drank and they spent the night there. And when it arose the next morning, he said, send me away to my master. And her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that she may go. Had the family having second doubts? No, that's not what's happening here. It would have been customary. I'm going to give my daughter away in marriage. We're going to have a little family time as we prepare and send her off and so on and so forth. So let her stay 10 days and then she can go. And he said to them, do not delay me. Since the Lord has prospered my way, send me away that I might go to my master. Okay, I'm going to use pure imagination here. Right? I'm trying to put myself a little bit in the servant's shoes. Abraham's got all this confidence and this faith in God. And I've seen God bless Abraham. I'm a little nervous about this commitment that I'm going on. I get out there and I see God provide in such a way that I'm stunned by it. Right? I can't wait to get back and tell Abraham what happened. I think that's a little bit of what's going on here. I mean, he probably could have stayed 10 days. I mean, he traveled this journey back to the homeland and found the wife. He probably could have stayed there and brought her back in 10 days. Abraham may not have thought twice about it. What's 10 days in the whole scene of things? But if I'm the servant, I think what's going on here is he can't wait. He's like, no, I got to go now. I got to go tell these people what God's done. I mean, twice in here it talks about how he bowed his head to the earth, right? He is so struck by God's provision for him. I think he wants to rush back. He says, no, don't hold me back here. I got to go now, right? And so then they said, let us call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. Again, let me just pause there. As a father of 3 daughters, all of whom are happily married and married great guys and have no regrets. I'm not speaking about the condition of their marriage, but I'll just tell you, as they approached the wedding day, they got pretty attached to family. They were pretty tight. They wanted to be around mom and dad. They wanted to be around their siblings. They wanted to be home when they could. They weren't out running around doing all their different stuff. There was sort of this, hey, I'm leaving the house. I'm going to make the most of the days that I have prior to the wedding here with my family. Not Rebekah. She's like, yep, I'll go. That demonstrates a lot of faith for a young woman.
She also would her brother Laban, as we'll learn about him later.
Yeah, we'll learn about Laban more later, that's true. Yeah. And then when you get to chapter, at the end of the book here, verses 53 through 66, and I just say a love story begins, right? And we love that part. She looks up and she sees Isaac in the distance, and he looks back and sees her coming, and you have a hallmark moment. But what you really see here is God's providing. I said at the beginning that if I was going to call a title on this one lesson, it would be Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. And in chapter 22, God provides a ram. In chapter 23, God provides land. In chapter 24, God provides the means by which He's going to fulfill the promise that Abraham's descendants are going to be like the stars of the sky. God provides. Jehovah Jireh. Questions, comments, thoughts? It should encourage our hearts, folks. Abraham was justified by his faith, and the New Testament reiterates we're justified exactly the same way. And all along the way, it's God that provides what we need and beyond what we need. Things that we don't deserve, God provides. And He does so not on the basis of our works, not on the basis of what we think we're worth. He does so on the basis of our faith. He's the justifier. All right, let's close in prayer. Lord, I do thank You for Your word. I thank You for the encouragement of it. I thank You for the example of Abraham. He was an imperfect man. It talks about how he walks in Your ways, but we know that he didn't always consistently 100% of the time walk in Your ways. But he always had faith, and he obeyed. And so, Lord, we're encouraged, realizing as we look in the mirror each day what our own weaknesses are and the times that we have doubts and we have fears and we sin and we fail. At the same time, we know that if we put our faith and our trust in You, that You are the one who will provide for us, and that You reward that faith with righteousness. And so, Lord, we thank you for your provision. We thank you for the example of Abraham. We thank you for the lessons that are yet to come and seeing how you work in bringing about your promises and delivering your people. We ask for your blessing in our day. In Jesus' name.